So, you know when you click that like button on Facebook, it automatically registers it in the database? Like I click like, I navigate away from that like and go back to it. I'm still liking that page. Yet through that whole process, the actual web page never changed. This is Ajax. This is asynchronous JavaScript and XML. That's what Ajax stands for. So what that means is when I click on something, instead of the page reloading like a synchronous request, the page doesn't have to reload. That's because there's all these things going on in the background, which is being handled by JavaScript itself. JavaScript's actually handling the request for us, so our browser, our page, doesn't need to refresh at all. And that's the purpose of using Ajax, and you see it in the majority of modern web pages out there, right? It's out there so much that it's just really a big part of building a web application. So we want to learn how to do it with Django Forms. Now, of course, we actually are going to be following along with this guide, cur.co r1tsdb. That guide is going to be updated as we get comments from you guys if necessary, but really this is going to be your main reference on how to AJAXify your Django Forms in the simplest way possible. Yes, there are other ways to do this, but what we want to do is take a form, we're going to make our own form, and then we are going to add Ajax to it. So initially, it's not going to have Ajax. Initially, it's literally just going to work off of a standard Django form so we can see it in action just as a standard Django form. So what we're going to do is go ahead and get started. Now, a couple things that you're going to want to make sure you have done. Number one, you're going to want to have Django installed. This is definitely means that you also have some experience with Django. So at least try Django, our latest one, which is try Django 1.11. Those two things are pretty much required to get this done. Hopefully you already knew that. So we're actually going to also reference the code that's on GitHub. So if you go to GitHub, you'll see our AJAXify Django Forms code here. And this is the code that we're going to be using. Now we're also going to have the final code on here as well. I'll actually put it into another directory called final src. So src, this first one, is the blank source that we're working with just for your own reference. Now, what we're going to be doing is, first of all, creating this Django form. Now, this form can be used as a standard form or as, a model form. It doesn't really matter. So let's go ahead and just copy this code here. I'm going to create forms.py. A lot of this stuff should be absolutely reviewed for you at this point. But there's a form. It's got an email form and a name. That's all. We're going to go ahead and create a form view. Of course, this could also work in a function-based view, but we're really just going to be covering the form view itself. So it's got a lot of default things already built in, and I have the form also in there as well. So this is that join form from that app. Notice that I called it your app, much like in the docs here, but yeah, you don't have to call it that. Okay, so now that we've got this, I'm going to go ahead and bring it into my URLs, and we'll go ahead and import it in here from your app.views, import join form view. I'm going to just copy this one off, and we'll just call this join form view as view, and we'll put a little $sign here to signify the end of that URL pattern. Let's go ahead and run our server. So python manage.py, run server. And we cannot import the name join form view, so let's make sure we have the name correct and we have everything saved. I saved it, now it's working. I'm gonna go ahead and open up my local host here. And of course my URL is routed. I go ahead and go into it, and I see my form actually rendered. Now, of course, I already have the template created for it, so that's already there. Of course, all of that is also on our source code here in the template, so if you wanted to check that out. But we now have our form there, right? Very simple, basic stuff. So what I want to do is actually update my form to handle Ajax-related things. I'm going to go ahead and copy this code for just a moment, and we're going to go back into our view and paste it in here. Now, form invalid and form valid, these are methods that are inherited from the form view, of course, and that's where this stuff is coming through, right? So it's getting the response either way, whatever it is, and then handling the data as such. Now, I'm going to go ahead and leave out the Ajax stuff for just a moment so we can see the data that may or may not be coming through. I'll just go ahead and do print cleaned form.cleaned data. We'll just print it after this super call that is going based off of, that standard form view. Not really going to worry about the invalid stuff just yet. So let's go ahead and come back here, and I'll just put in an email address, abc@gmail or whatever. Doesn't really matter. Say Justin, I'll hit submit, and I get a little error here. So a couple things I need to adjust, and I did this on purpose. Number one, we've got our form here. We want to make sure our method is post. The next thing we want to do is we want to make sure we have our Csrf token. Right, so we want to make sure we have that token actually built in to our form so that it's not a GET request by default and it has the necessary protection. I hit submit this time. Now it redirects me to form success as we told it to, and then I can also see that data that's coming through, right? So going back into our view, no matter what our view is, that data is actually going to come through as long as we're submitting that data correctly. So it was submitted. We were able to get all the information as needed. Now it's time to turn this into Ajax. It's really simple. We just go ahead and change whether or not the request is Ajax, and then we handle it as such, right? So if it's an Ajax request, it will come through as Ajax. If it's a standard HTTP request, that is a synchronous request, it will come in as that. Okay, so since we've got this Ajax, we also need to import that JSON response. So we'll go ahead and do that with from Django.http import JSON response. That is JavaScript object notation. So whenever you use Ajax, you have to return JSON. You have to return something that JavaScript knows how to handle. And that's what we are doing. That's why we're returning that response as JSON. Of course, we can add in some other data or other items in here if we wanted, but we don't need to. Like, we don't need to add in that form data because the form itself or the JavaScript itself would already know what that data is, meaning we don't have to send it back. There's no real reason to do it. The JavaScript doesn't reload at all. Where on other cases, you might reload to a different page, like form success, you might need to add that data into context. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, definitely take a look at one of our more in-depth tutorials that cover forms. Okay, so what we've got here now is we have some data that's coming through, right? So this is pretty standard stuff. We might want to use this over and over again. So if we scroll down a little bit, we have this Ajax form Mixin. Now this is just taking all of this stuff out and turning it into a Mixin instead of just right in the view itself. So you want to get used to doing stuff like this. Whenever you see that this might be a redundant or information that we are going to use over and over again, you want to get in the habit of creating a Mixin. So I'll do this as class, and this is going to be Ajax Mixin, and it's going to take an object. And this is all we're going to return. Form. It's going to be form-related Ajax Mixin. Well, let's call it Ajax form Mixin, as we said here. And then again, we have to import the actual JSON response. So from Django.http import JSON response. And then we have to change our super call to calling the Ajax form Mixin, which that means it's going to call whatever class we're in. Whatever form class we're in, that is. And now what I can do on that view, I can just go ahead and do from Mixins import Ajax form Mixin, put that in here, and we'll get rid of that JSON response. We no longer need that. So now it's a lot cleaner. So if we had 10 other Ajax forms on this app, we could totally just add that Mixin in, and it will handle each one the same. It's not really doing anything with the form valid or form invalid methods. In fact, it's still validating the form as the validations would be, right? So inside of your form, you might have a validation in here, such as define, well, we'll clean email, takes in self, email equals to self.cleaned data.get email, and then we'll say if email equals to, some sort of validation error that we might have. So in this case, I'll just make it simple. If it's email to that, we'll do raise forms.validation error, we'll say this is not valid. Otherwise, we'll return that email. Of course, this is form data and forms. Hopefully you know this. If you don't, check out Django Forms Unleashed on joincfp.com. Now, if we go back in here, we refresh, and I do abc@gmail and some whatever name, it says this is not valid. So that's a validation that will still happen for Ajax as well, which we will show you to test out. Now, of course, this isn't actually on the guide. This is really just going into more depth so you can see these things in action. So with the front end setup, we have to make sure that we're using a jQuery version that uses Ajax. So by default, the standard jQuery library does. Now, of course, to do Ajax, you actually don't need to only use jQuery. There's other JavaScript libraries out there that will handle Ajax for us. So you can do some research on those, but something like Angular or even React, those things can do Ajax for us as well. We don't have to use jQuery to do it. But for us, we're using jQuery because it's a tried and true method. It's really easy to implement as well. So for that reason, we're going to stick with using jQuery. Now in this case, in the docs, I put this version of jQuery. It's version 1.12.4. That's what I put on the guide. But if you actually looked at our template, what you'll see in there is you'll see a different version. Now this version says .slim. Now this is coming from Bootstrap version 4, so that's the reason that slim is in there. Now you just need to get rid of slim because slim doesn't actually allow for Ajax. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all of the other things as well. And this is going to be the version of jQuery that we end up using. And I have got this block JavaScript down here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, bring it into my ajax.html file here. And we're going to go ahead and do our JavaScript. I'm actually going to copy directly from the guide. I'll copy the Ajax call or the JavaScript that we have right here from the guide. And before I actually run it, I'm going to just change this JavaScript to being JavaScript 2 block or having it as that block only because I don't want it to run just yet. The other thing is I want to make sure that I have this class installed here as well as this data URL because we're going to look at that right now. So I refresh into my join form and I go ahead and inspect the element here. And what I'll see is my class is, I've got a form class, that's cool. And then I have a data URL here, right? So this call right here is from Django and it's a Django template and it's just allowing us to have a URL or the requested URL being built there. So that means if I change the URL, by default, the submit area or where we want to push this URL or this data is going to be there, right? So you could change this endpoint how you see fit. The next thing is I'm going to just using the post method. That's the only method I'm going to be using for this form. And then finally, I have this Csrf token. I'm going to go ahead and cut that out for a moment and just try out our form. I'm going to do abc@gmail, which should ring a validation error. I go ahead and hit submit, and instead I get a Csrf verification failed. Okay, so let's bring that back in. We'll save it, and we've got that going. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and create that block JavaScript again. Even though I have the reference code below here, I'm just going to go ahead and create it from scratch. And that way we can talk about each line. So first of all, I want to make sure it's in a script tag because it is JavaScript. And of course, being that it is in a script tag, we can use it as an external JavaScript after we're done testing. So I'm going to go ahead and do document ready function. There we go. So this is a standard call when you're doing some jQuery stuff. And the first thing is I want to get the data from this form. And I also want to prevent this form from submitting or doing its default method. The default method would be sending it using a synchronous request. Of course, we want to send it using an asynchronous request. So to do this, I have to select this form by declaring a variable. And I'm just going to call it the variable var equals to my form and using $.myAjaxForm, just like this with parentheses and quotes and everything. This is going to be that form, right? So this actually grabs that form and we can do stuff to it, right? So I could actually add something like my form.add class and we'll say form. Okay, so I refresh in here, inspect the element, and I look at my form. I've got my class here and it says form. If this part doesn't work or it's confusing to you, you're definitely going to want to learn more about jQuery. Okay, so, and we do have some stuff on joincfe.com/projects about jQuery there. Now, we've got our form and it's time to prevent it from doing what it's naturally going to do. So to do that, we're just going to go ahead and do myForm.submit. There's a method on this form called submit by default, and it takes in a function that can pass in the event. So the event being that, hey, it's being submitted. That's the event. So it comes in by default. You could call it something else. You might see it as EV or just E, but I'm going to call it event to be just more robust. And we'll say event.prevent default. I save that, I refresh in here, abc@gmail, put in some stuff, hit submit. Nothing seems to happen. Well, nothing does happen because we prevented that default. If I comment that out and do it again, hit submit, it gives me that validation error, right? Okay, so we're going to prevent that default from happening. Instead, we want to submit it the way we want to submit it, right? So I'm going to get the data from this form. So say var form data equals to this dot serialize. This is by far the fastest way to get all the data that's in this form. So if I did console log of this form data and saved it, refresh in here. Let's go ahead and refresh and join ABC, put some stuff in, hit submit, go into the JavaScript console, view developer JavaScript console. There's definitely these consoles on other browsers. But if we go in there, we see the Csrf middleware token, we see email, and we see name. So that middleware token was added because we added that template tag, right? So it's in here, input type hidden, name, and so on. Okay, cool. So we now have this data. Let's see here. I have data, and I've also prevented the form from being submitted. I also have a URL, which is this URL. And really easily, we can just say this URL equals to, well, we want to get the form itself, so my form, and then dot attribute, and we're going to get data-URL. And if this URL was not set, as in if it wasn't even there, so let's go ahead and cut it out. I'm just going to do window.location, and we want to get the window location href, so the path or the hyperlink reference for that. And we can do this a couple ways. So I can console log this URL, refresh in here, console log, I'll hit submit, or I have to still fill out some stuff here, hit submit, I get that URL coming through. So if you set that data URL right on here to something different, data-URL equals to new endpoint, you would get whatever that is, right? So new endpoint. Now in this case, I'm actually going to keep it as join because that's actually where we're sending this form. So I hit submit, or I'm going to have to refresh again and hit submit, and there it goes. It's going to join. So that's the endpoint that it's actually going to. So now all we need to do, we have an endpoint, we have data. So instead of this URL, it's actually this endpoint, or that's what we'll call it. I know the docs or the guide will say something different, but it's technically an endpoint. So we have our endpoint, we have our data, and then we also have a method. Of course, you could go off of the method of the form itself, but I'm just going to, by default, use the post method. So now let's go ahead and create our Ajax call. It's really simple, $.Ajax. Use the two curly brackets on the inside to set up the Ajax call. Method, we're going to say post URL, and we called it the endpoint here. Data is that form data. And then we want to have success and failure calls. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy from the actual docs, even though I have it right in here. I'll explain these functions in just a second. There we go. My form. Very good. Okay. So I'm going to get rid of this last block here so we can discuss. So if the data comes back success, that is, if the form is successful, going back to the Mixin, if it's valid and it successfully sends, it'll send that back. If it's invalid, it will do something like this. Now, there are other potentials for invalid calls. So let's actually take a look at this. I refresh in here and do abc@gmail, hit some submit stuff, and I get a 400 bad request. Well, if I actually look back here, this will say email is not valid. So let's do email abc123. And then it says my form reset is not an actual method. So this just has to do with the naming. It should actually be my form 0 or the array of 0. That's how you're going to go ahead and refresh it. So 123@gmail and then something. Okay. So this is assuming that everything's working. You might be getting an error. What we did outside of this video were some tests on the next and actually required call, which is enabling Django Csrf ready Ajax calls. So when we do this Ajax, we actually have Csrf token in the data, but it's not validating correctly. Like it shouldn't actually be validating. So let's go ahead. I'm going to open it up in an incognito window to try it out with my JavaScript console open, abc@gmail. I'll hit submit. I still get my bad request, and in here it's giving me the response JSON as well. So as we see, there's the response JSON, and it's saying email, this is not valid, right? So that alone is showing me that my error is actually working, and it's showing the different errors that possibly could be there. But this all is reliant on the fact that my jQuery call is really actually not that good. But when I submit this data, it does say successfully submitted data. That's great. So it looks like even the validations are working. But there is one thing that I'm for sure going to have in here, and that's using enabling the step 4 of this guide is to make sure that we have our cookies in here. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy all of this method here. And right above our block JavaScript, I'm going to add another script in here and just bring it in, tab these things in. And again, this script can be external, but what this does is it allows and makes sure that our Csrf token is inside of our call. So if we go back to our form and actually get rid of that Csrf token, save it, refresh in here, I should still get it successfully submitting this data, assuming that everything is saved and done correctly. Okay, so that's really all of the Ajax stuff. Now, you can handle these forms because if it's successful, if it sends back a successful HTTP status method or HTTP status code, that is, then it will go to this actual function and you can handle it as you see fit. Of course, that data right there is the data that's coming from the back end, and then you can handle the form error as you may need. Now, of course, I made this script specifically so it wouldn't be inside of a Django template. So I'm actually going to get rid of this block JavaScript, instead go back into base.html, put another script here, bring it in, and we're just going to test it on this. We don't need 2 scripts actually, so we're going to test it right in here as it should actually work now. So we'll save it, refresh abc123@gmail, some whatever name, I hit submit, and it successfully submitted the form data. It looks like it submitted it twice. So I'm going to just go ahead and make sure that I save everything and refresh again. And there it goes. It only submitted it once that time. The reason I knew it submitted it twice is because it logged this twice. So it did the success call 2 times. Now again, this is best practice. You want to pull your JavaScript out. Now, of course, even further would be to put this in its own JavaScript file and have it being rendered like an external file using static files as Django would load static files. So that's the other part that you would definitely want to do prior to bringing this into a production environment. That's just the best practice for doing so. And this code, the reason I didn't go through it is because it comes directly from the Django docs, and you can learn more about it there. Hopefully this helped you understand a little bit more about Ajaxifying any given form. The nice thing about this too is now I can actually move this form anywhere. And if I explicitly write out the fields, that is, if I wrote out email field as well as name field, I could then paste this form anywhere. It doesn't have to actually render form as P. The only exception to this would be adding a URL for the URL in here, or excuse me, not URL, but action in here that would go for the fallback. That is, if JavaScript was turned off, we want to make sure that we have our action in there, just like we have that data URL. But this data URL and this action may be different, which is why I had you see those two different things, so you can use that as well. Now, the last thing that I'll say is you are going to want to try to do this using the Django REST framework. So if you don't know about the Django REST framework, definitely check it out on our projects so you can take a look and learn a little bit more about how you would be using an API endpoint instead of your standard Django views to handle your Ajax requests. That is the challenge I leave for you. All right, so if you have any questions, please let us know in the comments below. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully you got a lot out of it. I will say that if you want to go one step further, you can absolutely check out our blog. We have all sorts of things in here that will help you get better at web development or launching your projects in general. The other thing is joining us on YouTube. That's joincfe.com/YouTube. Make sure that you go ahead and subscribe in there and make sure you hit that bell. And then you also might consider checking out the Django likes tutorial. This tutorial right here shows you how to create a like button using Ajax. So we will cover some of the same sort of topics, but it's not quite as form level. It's much more about likes and how to actually implement something like likes. Thanks again for watching, and can't wait to see you in the next one.